Hey everyone, welcome to Seneca Lake Mysteries, the podcast where we explore the unusual, strange, and unexplained on New York's largest Finger Lake. So after 2 episodes in a row with a guest who was Soraya Azkath of the Where Did the Road Go podcast, it's just me again, and I've got some old-timey, really cool stories as well as some more recent stories. So thanks so much for joining me. First off, I want to thank everyone for all the support, for listening, for subscribing, for all the comments, the messages, the emails. And, you know, the thing is, I've listened to a bunch of podcasts, and you always hear the hosts thanking everyone for listening and thanking people for their support or asking for support. But I really wanted to slow it down a little bit and just speak from the heart and let you guys know just how much I really do appreciate it. When I started this podcast, like I've said before, this was just a hobby of mine, collecting these stories. I would tell them to people once in a while, and people would tell me their stories, but that was about it. It was a hobby of mine, and I didn't know if it was the kind of thing that there would really be an audience for. I suspected there would be. I had an intuition there would be, but I wasn't really certain to my bones. But now I'm learning very quickly that there are a lot of you out there who enjoy these stories just as much as I do. And you're willing to take the time and listen to me tell these stories, and to take the time to tell other people to listen to the podcast, to send me these emails and messages and comments and phone calls. I really appreciate all of them. Every time I get a message from someone with a question or a tip, you know, are you going to talk about this in a later show? Or I liked when you talked about this, or here's a story I heard. I'm just over the moon every time I get one of these messages. And I know that as time goes on, the show's going to evolve. I'm going to cover a lot of different topics, everything from old-timey stories to some of the more arcane and esoteric takes on the area and what all these stories mean. And so far, so good. I'm really enjoying the heck out of this. I'm so glad you're all here to go along for the ride. But actually, maybe I should rephrase that, because you're not only along for the ride, so many of you are helping me to steer this as well, letting me know what you want to hear more about, giving me ideas for future episodes. So yeah, this is everything I dreamed it would be and more. The more feedback I get from you guys, the more I really, really want to give you a good show each time out. So stay tuned in the future. I know I've said this in the past, that I've got some great guests coming up. One of the things I'm learning early on here doing this podcast is how it can be kind of tricky to schedule people for the podcast, especially people who aren't used to doing podcasts. Maybe they have a story or an experience that's unusual, and it might be the first time that they're talking about it. Also, these are people from all different walks of life with all kinds of things going on in their lives and all kinds of, challenges, busy schedules, just like a lot of us. So a few of the people I had expected to have on by now aren't on by now, but I'm hopeful for the future. I'm still putting the call out, and I'm still reaching out to a lot of folks, asking them to come on here and share their experiences or their knowledge or their wisdom or their reflections on the mysteries of Seneca Lake. And hey, if you're listening to this right now and you feel like you have something to offer the podcast, reach out to me. Let me know. podcast@senecalakemysteries.com, or you can call, leave a voicemail, or send a text to 607-307-1167. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any suggestions of someone you know or know of that you feel would be a good fit for the podcast, reach out and let me know about them as well. And if you send me a message, I will get back to you. So again, thank you so much. Whether you're listening locally from Geneva or Watkins Glen or Burdett or Benton or Lodi or Romulus or Dresden or Dundee or Valois or Willard or Himrod or Montour Falls or anywhere close to the lake, or if you're listening from further away, Rochester, Syracuse, Sweden, Ireland, around the world, I see you all and I appreciate you all and I thank you. I know it's getting a little redundant here, but thank you so much for being a part of this. Now, the other thing you hear on every podcast is requests to continue giving your support. So I'm going to ask you all again to please subscribe, follow me on social media, keep sharing the show. It would be really helpful if you're listening to the podcast, but you haven't subscribed on your podcast platform, to subscribe there, leave reviews. That really helps with the algorithm and helps more people know about the show. And it helps put me in a position, ideally in the future, where I can start doing some advertising and generating a bit of revenue and help me take care of hosting fees and the other costs that go into the podcast, and to just make it easier for me to bring you more and better shows on the 7th, 17th, and 27th of every month. Now, if you're a local business who's interested in advertising on the show, please reach out to me. I can share with you some of the numbers, the listenership that the podcast has. And of course, you'd be advertising to people who really love Seneca Lake and either spend time here or live near here or have spent time around the lake. So yeah, give me a shout. Let me know. And also, if you would like to donate to the show, I would greatly appreciate that. And right now, you could donate through Venmo. My Venmo is at Seneca Lake. And I would be so grateful for any kind of donation at all. But it's not required. Obviously, you can still listen to the show, and I'm still deeply grateful that you're here. And also, as the show continues to grow, I plan to set up a Patreon where you can subscribe and pay a little bit each month for extra content that you won't hear on the podcast. So stay tuned for that. It's not set up yet, but stay tuned for that. And let's see. Before we get to our main stories this week, I wanted to talk a little bit about a topic or a place that I plan to do some future episodes on. Now, I wasn't planning to do any episodes on this particular location when I started the podcast, because I wanted to focus on locations that are within roughly 4 miles of the shores of Seneca Lake. However, there's a place a little bit further away, maybe 7 or 8 miles to the south of Seneca Lake, not far from the hamlet of Alpine, and that place is known as the Connecticut Hill Wildlife Management Area. Now, Connecticut Hill is pretty widely known as a place where a lot of very strange things occur. There's an old cemetery there, people call the Witches Cemetery. There have been numerous paranormal investigators and even Bigfoot investigators up there on Connecticut Hill, because over the years, there have been a wide variety of high strangeness reports, from Bigfoot to UFOs to strange lights in the woods to the Oz effect, lost time, strange sounds, strange voices. The list goes on and on. And unsurprisingly, I've gotten a whole lot of messages from people and a whole lot of suggestions to do an episode about Connecticut Hill. And something else that I realize is that Connecticut Hill is at the southernmost part of the Seneca Lake watershed. So, you know what? I'm going to say that it's part of the Seneca Lake Mysteries area. And I'm going to let you know that I'm not sure when, but in the coming weeks, I will be doing an episode about Connecticut Hill. I also plan to go up there and look around, see what I can find. So for those of you who asked for it, you're going to get it. I'll have a show on Connecticut Hill coming at you very soon. So that's about it for now. Let's get on to the stories for this week. I'll be talking about some crazy orb sightings, in the last few years in Geneva, in a particular area along North Street. Then I'm going to move into some old-time stories about cursed or hexed steamboats from the steamboat era on Seneca Lake, and also another story from just after the steamboat era, kind of a crazy story about a boat called the Portadora, which began its life as a luxury vessel on Seneca Lake before it turned to a life of crime. So again, thanks so much for being here. I really do genuinely appreciate it. And yeah, let's get into it. So back in the fall of 2022, I learned about an incident that had taken place earlier that year from someone I knew personally. They were aware of my interest and my Seneca Lake Mysteries project, so they didn't reach out to me specifically to tell me the story. Rather, we had met up in person and they said, hey, this is something you might be interested in, and relayed the story to me. The incident took place on North Street in Geneva, in the vicinity of Geneva High School. Now, I want to be careful about how much detail I give about this event due to the witnesses wanting confidentiality. So I'm not going to be very detailed in describing where it took place. But here's the story as it was told to me. One morning in the spring of 2022, a resident in this neighborhood had discovered the driver's side window of their car had been shattered during the night. So immediately they assumed that it was a vandal who had broken the window. So they, like many places these days, they have a security camera outside aimed right at the car. So they reviewed the security footage. Now, the security camera was positioned from the passenger side, so you couldn't see the driver's side window specifically, but you could see the entire vehicle. Now, in the video, it was around 3 or 4 a.m., and suddenly a floating, airborne bright light, about maybe the size of a softball or a volleyball, but it was difficult to tell due to this light, this orb being so bright. So this light came into the frame and moved around the vehicle, and then moved low, almost to the ground, or maybe even to the ground, on the opposite side of the car, on the driver's side, out of the camera's view. The light paused there for several seconds, and then it rose up again to a height slightly above the roof of the car. And then suddenly the light zigzagged back and forth approximately 4 or 5 times, and then shot off out of camera range at what was an impossible speed. The witness said it was similar to like taking a laser pointer and pointing it at a wall and then shaking it back and forth real quickly and moving it away. The video was clear and unambiguous. Even though it was night vision, you could still very clearly see the vehicle and anything around it, and this strange light, which had gone down on the side of the vehicle where the driver's side window was that broke, and then took off, and the window was broken. So numerous witnesses actually viewed this footage. Multiple people looked at it, and nobody could figure out what it was, obviously. So it was considered, well, maybe they should contact the police because of the vandal, because of the broken window, but they understood that the police wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And they discussed further whether or not to go public with the footage, either to put it on social media or otherwise. And the decision was made to simply replace the car window and forget that the event happened. And the reason these folks didn't want to go public with it was the attention it might cause. They didn't want investigators to come. They didn't want to be interviewed. They valued their privacy. So yeah, that was basically going to be the end of it. Now, I can't be 100% sure, but I believe that the original footage was recorded over. Like, it wasn't saved, it wasn't kept. Nobody really needed to keep the footage around any longer, so it was recorded over. However, there was at least one person that did copy the footage off of the monitor screen, I believe, of the event. But that person, I'm not sure who that is. I'm not sure if they want to release the video. Now, I want to make it clear that the witness who told me the story, I trust this person completely. They had no reason to fabricate this, and their description was honest and authentic, their response to the entire event. So at the time, I noted the story. I said, wow, that's a great one, and kind of put it aside, hoping that maybe one day I could follow up on it. Maybe the witnesses might want to reveal what happened. Maybe the video would surface. But then a few months later, in late 2022, I was looking at UFO sightings online, and I found a UFO sighting report that got my attention and made me reconsider the car window incident, which was apparently damaged by a low-flying glowing orb. So I was looking through sightings on a website called UFOstalker.com. Now, there are a bunch of other websites with UFO databases that have far more sightings, but UFO Stalker is still one that I check on occasion. So it's a very short description. The sighting, there's not a lot of detail to it, but here's the information that comes from that sighting. It occurred on April 26th, 2022 at 4:06 p.m., and it took place at Geneva Middle School and High School on North Street. So it's basically one long sentence giving you the whole sighting. And this is how it reads. First, it mentions that it was a sighting of a light, of some kind of light, and it describes it as such. Quote, "It was over by a parking lot, just moving all over the place with a white light, even turning red, then moved over to our field and was hovering a little more higher, then just got higher, then went back to the parking lot and was gone." End quote. So when I read this, I realized, wow, this is less than a quarter mile from the Orbs sighting with the car damage. So now I have one solid sighting with multiple witnesses and apparently video, and now a second sighting describing a very similar object, very close to where the first sighting took place. So I'm talking about it today because I want to put it out there to all of you, especially my listeners in Geneva. Have you seen any strange low-flying lights or orbs moving and hovering around the North Street, Carter Road neighborhood and near the school? Do you know anyone who has? If so, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. And also, I'm looking for anyone with info on the incident with the car window and the footage, especially the person out there who apparently has a copy of this footage. Please reach out to me. I will keep your anonymity, confidentiality. I honor those at all times, and I'd like to explore this more. I'd like to look into this more, see what's going on up there on North Street, and see if it's something that other people have experienced as well. So there you go. Okay, folks, so I have a bunch of stories that are all under the umbrella of one main story, and I call that story Seneca's Steamboat Hex. So Seneca Lake's steamboat era took place from 1828 through the 1920s. In its heyday, these steamers would run on a regular schedule from Geneva to Watkins Glen, about a 4-hour trip with several stops along the way. So these big wooden vessels, depending on their size, could transport anywhere from 50 to 1,500 passengers in a single trip, while also towing multiple canal boats and delivering various goods to and from locations up and down the lake. Now, passengers would take the steamboat for a variety of reasons. Many Geneva businessmen who lived south of the city would take their daily commute aboard a steamer, while other residents and visitors could pay the 25-cent fare to visit friends or shop or conduct business or just take excursions to recreational attractions or to just enjoy the scenery. Now, the finer steamboats offered private cabins, fine meals in the dining room, and musical entertainment in the staterooms or on the promenade decks. There were an estimated 75 different steamers that traveled the waves of Seneca during this era, many of which were built at boatyards along the lake shore in places including Geneva, Lodi Landing, Long Point, Dundee, and Watkins Glen. Now, because these boats were made of wood and powered by large coal and wood-burning furnaces, steamboat fires were common. Still, many locals at the time believed that there was a hex on the steamboats of Seneca that was responsible for the numerous accidents, fires, sinkings, and even deaths that struck a good number of these steamboats. But possible hexes aside, many of the more prominent steamers of the era had histories that were filled with bizarre and striking stories, and here are just a few of them. So the first one I call the Seneca Chief, aka the Geneva. So the Seneca Chief went from Geneva to Watkins Glen and back on July 3rd, 1828, which heralded the start of the steamboat era on Seneca Lake. The 90-foot-long boat left Geneva around 8 a.m. and made it to Watkins at around 1 p.m., where it was greeted by a group of around 4,000 to 5,000 people who were eager to see this new steamboat, this new technology on its maiden voyage. So after the Seneca Chief stayed in Watkins for about 2 hours, it made its way back to Geneva and docked at around 8 p.m. Now, within the next year, the steamboat's owners had built a cabin on the deck, raised the wheels, and completed some other improvements to increase comfort, speed, and appearance. But in January 1832, the Seneca Chief sank at a wharf in Geneva after a storm. The boat was eventually raised. They did more upgrades on it, and by the next year, it was sold to new owners who promptly lengthened the boat by 35 feet and renamed it the Geneva. So around 1847 or 1848, the Geneva had reached the end of its career, but disposing of a 125-foot-long steamboat wasn't going to be easy. So that little problem was solved when it was decided that the steamer would be packed with explosive powder and blown up off of the shore in Geneva as part of the 4th of July celebration. So an estimated 10,000 onlookers gathered along the shore, eagerly awaiting the spectacle, and the Geneva was loaded with powder, was placed far offshore, and a long wire was connected to an electric battery that was run to set off the explosion. After several attempts, the powder failed to ignite. So a few people got into a boat. This little boating party was dispatched with a fuse to approach the steamer and trigger the explosion by introducing fire. However, it turned out that the powder had somehow become wet, and the boating party could only manage to light the steamboat on fire. So at first, the crowd was disappointed that they didn't get to see the Geneva blow up. Yet, once the fire started raging, it was sending flames up high into the night sky and brightly lighting up the harbor and the shore. The spectators ended up having a pretty good time anyway. Now, the next story I call Death Toll on the Watkins. The Watkins was another early Seneca Lake steamer. It was built in 1853 and ended up having a dark history that unfolded within a very short span of time. Several years after the Watkins went into service, the newly invented steamboat propeller was added to the steamboat. But the excitement of the new propeller didn't last long because a propeller accident on Seneca Lake killed 2 people. The Watkins was taken out of service for a short time, but not long after it returned to work, there was another horrific accident that happened on the Watkins. 2 bolt heads on the boiler were blown off by an explosion, killing 1 boiler operator and injuring another. And despite the boat's death toll, it was returned to service for a few more years, but eventually taken out of service and the engines were removed and the hull was left to rot. Moving on to the next story, the Onondaga, contaminated war hero. So in 1860, a steam-powered paddle wheel towboat named the Perez H. Fields was built. When the American Civil War began in 1861, the boat was commissioned by the U.S. government to transport troops. So enlisted Union soldiers would be picked up along the shore in Geneva and transported on the Perez H. Fields to Watkins Glen before those soldiers would head to the Union encampment in Elmira, about 24 miles away, and then they would travel on to the battlefields across the South. It's likely that hundreds or maybe even thousands of Union soldiers rode on the Perez H. Fields down Seneca Lake in the early 1860s. And after the Civil War ended, the steamer Onondaga ended up spending the next 5 years serving as a towboat. Now, the Seneca Lake Navigation Company, looking to increase their fleet of excursionist steamboats, commissioned a shipbuilder named Bruce Springstead, a highly renowned shipbuilder, Bruce Springstead, to rebuild and revamp the Perez H. Fields. And the result was a 175-foot-long, 500-passenger luxury ship. Now, the Onondaga was regarded as the largest steamer in service between the Hudson River and Buffalo, and the newly renamed Onondaga offered the finest in comfort and style on its trips between Geneva and Watkins Glen and points in between. Over the next couple of decades, as bigger and faster steamboats appeared on Seneca Lake, the Onondaga lost a bit of its shine, but it continued to carry passengers on its daily routes before finally being retired and docked in Geneva in 1895. Now, it seems that nobody was really sure what to do with this old steamboat, so the Onondaga remained at the dock in Geneva for the next 3 years. Then in 1898, the Smith Opera House in Geneva, a performing arts theater in Geneva, hosted the Joshua Simpkins Opera Company, who were performing one of the most popular shows of the time, the stage comedy Joshua Simpkins. Now, it was discovered that the road troupe, after arriving at Geneva, had brought smallpox with them. So local officials did what they thought was the best course of action, to quarantine all of the actors at the edge of the city in their private rail cars. And then once the actors were in there, they hosed down the rail cars with formaldehyde. Now, the quarantine didn't go as they had hoped because the infected actors, or the potentially infected actors, weren't staying inside the train. And the public was curious and they weren't staying away from the train. So the public health and government officials decided that this was no good. So they loaded the entire troop onto the Onondaga and then anchored the boat a ways away from shore in Geneva's harbor for a month-long quarantine. So these performers were going to stay on this steamboat floating in the middle of the harbor for a full month. Now, the performers made the best of their stay aboard their new floating home, even giving performances of Joshua Simpkins on the deck of the steamboat for the entertainment of the audiences that were gathered on shore. So when the traveling company finally disembarked the Onondaga at the end of the quarantine on June 24th, 1898, the legendary steamboat was now considered a floating biological hazard. So immediate disposal of this potentially infected boat was deemed necessary, and the Seneca Lake Steamboat Company came up with a plan to end the life of the Onondaga with a fiery extravaganza. So they decided that the Onondaga would be blown up on the lake off Kashong Point on September 14th, 1898, and it was advertised both as a celebration of the United States' recent victory in the Spanish-American War, and also as an homage to the explosion of the USS Maine, which had helped spur the start of the war earlier that year. So flyers promoting the event were distributed across New York and Pennsylvania, inviting visitors to enjoy, quote, a never-to-be-forgotten spectacle, end quote, and an estimated crowd of 5,000 people traveled from near and far to gather on both shores of the lake, both on the east and west, to watch the show. So a band played, hot air balloons were launched. It was quite a day, and after the paddle wheel and the other machinery were removed, 500 pounds of dynamite, 300 pounds of blasting powder, and a barrel of gasoline were distributed around the Onondaga. The Onondaga was then towed to the center of the lake off Kashong Point and was ignited at about 4:30 p.m. 3 long tongues of fire shot out from the ship, sending debris flying in all directions. A massive dome of dense yellow smoke surrounded and obscured the boat from view for a while as a 500-foot mushroom cloud rose into the sky. And over the next several days, small pieces of the Onondaga were found scattered on the lake. But this wasn't quite the end of the story of the Onondaga, because in August of 2012, almost 114 years after the explosion, the destruction of the Onondaga, a group of researchers located the wreckage of the steamboat at the bottom of Seneca Lake at a depth of around 400 feet. Next up, I have a story called The Mighty Ben Loader's Deadly End. So the largest and most powerful steamboat ever built on Seneca Lake was the Ben Loader. Construction on the boat was completed, and it was placed into service on Seneca Lake in 1849. Now it was a behemoth. It was 250 feet long and could transport 1,500 passengers at a time with a top speed of around 20 miles an hour. So at its peak, the Ben Loader was completing 4 round trips between Watkins Glen and Geneva each day. Then in 1853, the steamboat was sold to a new owner and converted to a towboat. Now, the way these towboats worked, they were horse-drawn canal boats that were carrying coal and agricultural products and building materials and other cargo that would arrive in Geneva on the Seneca Cayuga Canal. Then the canal boats would be tied together and hitched to a towboat, and then the towboat would pull the canal boats down the lake to be unloaded in Watkins Glen. Then the canal boats would be reloaded with cargo and towed back to Geneva. Now, the crew of each canal boat would take the trip from Geneva to Watkins and back, and they'd either leave their horses in one of the large horse barns in Geneva, or they'd bring the horses with them on the canal boats for the round trip. Some of the larger towboats were known to pull dozens of canal boats at one time. The largest number of canal boats ever towed at once was 70, and that record was held by, you guessed it, the Ben Loader. Now, in 1861, during its 12th year of service on Seneca Lake, the assistant engineer and a deckhand were killed on the Ben Loader by a boiler explosion. A dozen canal horses and several other crew members were scalded by the blisteringly hot water that came from the boiler during that explosion as well. Then, on the evening of May 15th, also 1861, the Ben Loader was on its way from Geneva to Watkins Glen, pulling 27 boats and 17 cribs of lumber. About 12 miles south of Geneva, the steamer encountered a sudden storm, and a violent gust of wind from the southwest slammed into the steamboat and its cargo, causing the last 11 boats that were tied to the Ben Loader and that were also filled with lumber, railroad ties, coal, and barley to break free. And the Ben Loader's crew watched in horror as 3 of the boats were lifted almost completely out of the water before plunging and disappearing into the waves. And on board those apparently sunken boats were the crew and their horses, all of whom were assumed dead. But the next morning, the Ben Loader and another steamboat, the St. Arnott, were sent to look for the missing boats and the crews and horses. And when they arrived at the scene of the previous evening's events, they found all of the boats and the crews either ashore or anchored nearby. Now, by some miracle, only minor injuries were suffered, and all the crew members were alive. It was learned, however, that when the 3 coal boats plunged underwater, they flipped over, lost their loads of coal, and then bobbed to the surface upside down. And in the process, 6 horses were lost. But interestingly, only one of those horses' corpses were found when it drifted to shore. Then, just a few weeks later, the Ben Loader finally met its end on June 2nd, 1861. The steamboat was docked at a coal trestle in Watkins Glen for the night, and at some point during the night, the Ben Loader caught fire. The flames raged out of control. The crew made the decision to cut the steamboat adrift so the fire wouldn't ignite the coal storage facility nearby and possibly the entire village. So the Ben Loader floated out onto Seneca Lake, fully engulfed in flames, and would be completely incinerated down to the waterline. Now, the next story is a quick one. I call it the legendary Otetiani's egg sighting finale. So this isn't necessarily evidence of a curse or a hex, but the final days of the Otetiani were a bit strange. You may recall, if you listened in episode 2, I talked about the incredible encounter between the Otetiani and the Seneca Lake serpent that took place in 1900, the most famous Seneca Lake serpent story ever. And after that event, the Otetiani continued doing regular routes between Geneva and Watkins Glen through late 1905. And it was around that time, 1905, 1906, that it was renamed the Seneca. And for the next 3 years, it was only intermittently in service between Watkins and Geneva. And when the steamboat reached the end of its useful life, it wasn't just disassembled for parts or burned in the lake or anything like that. It was docked in Watkins Glen in the winter of 1908 to 1909, and part of the boat was brought ashore and cut in half, and it began the final phase of its life as a hen house. And finally, we wrap up the stories of the Seneca steamboat hexes with the final tale, the sinking of the Manhattan and the end of the steamboats. So as railroads completely took over, the Manhattan was still regularly bringing passengers between Geneva and Watkins Glen in 1915. Now, this steamer, like many others that had traveled Seneca Lake over the previous 100 years, ended its career quite abruptly and in dramatic fashion. So the Manhattan was anchored at the northern end of the lake near the canal. Now, somehow one evening the steamer broke away from its moorings and went adrift, and it made its way about 100 feet through the canal before getting wedged under a bridge. So the crew came, the boat was dislodged, and then it was towed back and reattached to its moorings when the Manhattan promptly sunk. So the owners worked to successfully plug the leak and towed the Manhattan to Cayuga Lake and docked it there, at which point the Manhattan sunk again, marking the final chapter in Seneca Lake's steamboat era. Okay, so the steamboat era was over, but I have one more story from the early 1900s. Came right after the steamboat era, and I loved it. I think it's just a really delightful little tale, and I call it From Luxury Boating to Liquor Bootlegging, the tale of the Portadora. So in 1909, the first gasoline-powered boat to run a regular schedule on Seneca Lake was built. It was 43 feet long and capable of carrying 50 passengers. The name of the boat was the Portadora, and it was owned by Captain Frank Power. And the Portadora was a very sleek, very modern machine for its time. Now, 5 years after the Portadora's launch, Captain Tower wanted to find a way to attract more passengers to his boat. So he developed Pastime Park on the northeast side of the lake. On this property, Captain Tower built tennis courts, a picnic grove, a bathhouse, and a 5,000 square foot pavilion for entertainment and dancing. And pretty soon, Genevans began building cottages at Pastime Park where businessmen could spend the summer with their families while commuting back and forth to work on the Portadora. Now, after 9 years of running the Pastime Park route, the Portadora was removed from service and sold by Captain Tower to what was described as a group of New Yorkers in 1923. And those new owners were about to put that old passenger boat into a very different kind of service. The United States era of alcohol prohibition was in full swing at this time, which created the illegal bootlegging industry. Now, in the northeastern United States, one popular route to bring booze from Canada to the United States was via boat across Lake Ontario. And the new owners of the Portadora put the boat to work transporting this illegal alcohol, and these boats were called rum runners. Now, I'm not sure how long the Portadora was in service running alcohol, but eventually the long arm of the law caught up and the Portadora was seized by revenuers. And after having brought joy and laughter to so many countless families on Seneca Lake for so many years, the Portadora, like many rum runners of the era, was ordered to be destroyed. Well, that's it for this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any thoughts on any of the topics in this episode, please let me know. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss anything. A new podcast comes out every month on the 7s. I'll talk to you then.